I've been trying to make a survival-like game, but with a survival twist. And previously, I implemented the mechanics for the player, a drone companion, resource harvesting, enemies, and combat. However, there is currently one big problem in the game so far. It has no gameplay loop. And much like skydiving without a parachute, a game without a gameplay loop isn't much fun. So in this devlog, my goal is to implement the fundamental gameplay loop for my game, and in turn, hopefully make my game actually fun to play. Before getting to the fun part of actually implementing the gameplay loop, I think it's best to first plan out exactly what it's going to be. After thinking for a while, I've come up with 5 main stages that will make up the gameplay loop. The first is that the player will spawn into the world. This is then followed up by the player collecting resources and fighting enemies to gain experience points. The player then can spend its experience points gathered on temporary upgrades which only last its current session. Eventually the player will die after either making a mistake or from the enemies getting stronger over time and overwhelming the player. Finally, the player can then use the resources collected to buy permanent new abilities and upgrades, which can then be taken into the next game session. This completes the gameplay loop, which can be summarized as spawn, collect and fight, temporary upgrades, die, permanent upgrades. From previous development on the game, the sections for collect and fight are already done, which leaves 4 stages to implement to complete the gameplay loop. So to keep it light-hearted, let's start with death. Before something can die, it first must be alive, and that's why before we can implement the player being able to die, we first need to give it health. After working long and hard, I managed to produce this state-of-the-art health bar that puts most professional UI designers to shame, which looks even better when implemented into the game. The next step was to add functionality that allowed the player's health to be tracked. A button was added that would damage the player when pressed. It didn't work quite right at first, but after a few small tweaks I managed to get it working as intended. Now something needs to happen once the player's health reaches 0. I decided to make the player explode into loads of small particles, which looks pretty satisfying in the end. Next I added an attack mechanic to the enemies, that once close enough to the player would take damage. After this, I added a game over screen that appears once the player dies. I personally really like how it fades onto the screen. As you can see, a button appears at the bottom, which will allow the player to return to the menu, but currently doesn't do anything until that menu is created. Currently, there is no visual feedback when the player takes damage other than the health bar updating, which can be easily missed when focusing on the character. To solve this problem, I added blood spray particles and a damage texture when the player takes damage. After this, it was clearer when the player actually took damage. And while I'm at it, I'll also add this to the blob enemies, making the player's attack much more visually interesting. Now that is done, I think we can say that the death stage of the gameplay loop is complete, and now it's time to move on to the temporary upgrade stage. I want to model the temporary upgrade system on the level up system used in Vampire Survivor, where once the player gains enough experience, a menu will appear that lets you select between a few random upgrades. First, I roughly mocked up how this level up system would look, and then made it so it would only appear once the player reached 25 experience. And finally, made it so that if one of the options is clicked, the level up menu will disappear. After this, I put my artistic skills to the test once again and designed a few icons for each of the current level up options: drone attack, player health, and energy blade. I populated each of the level up options with these icons, alongside the name and level. Next, I made it so that when the level up menu appears, the game world pauses, allowing the player to take its time when deciding between options, or maybe go take a piss. I don't mind. On top of this, I implemented the system that increases the level of the selected option, showing the higher level version when the player levels up again. This goes until the particular option is at max level, where it no longer can be selected by the player. Okay, now it's actually time to add some functionality when the player clicks on one of the level ups. Because player health will be the easiest and I'm lazy, let's begin there. For the player health level up, all I need to do was update the player's max health to a larger value, which was as easy as it sounded. I also made it so that the player's health would be set to full when leveling up. After this, I moved on to the Energy Blade level up, where I created 3 new colours of Energy Blade to add to the current blue one. I then made it so that each level would come with its own distinct colour, and this would also come along with an increase in damage. This went from green for level 1, to blue, then to red, and finally orange. Lastly, I moved on to the Drone Attack level up, where much like the Energy Blade one, I created 2 new Plasma Bullet colours, green and blue. I then made it so that with each level, it would either give you a new bullet with increased damage or an increased fire rate. To finish off the stage, I added tooltips to each level up options to show exactly what is increasing with each level. And with that, we have completed the temporary upgrade stage of the gameplay loop. Now that we're roughly halfway through implementation, I think it's time to hear from today's sponsor. If you're like me and only go outside when truly necessary, choosing rather to spend most of your time on your computer either watching YouTube videos on random subjects that you'll never use in your life, or browsing Reddit or Twitter for that next momentary rush of dopamine, well then today's sponsor, Grass, will be perfect for you. Recommended by 9 out of 10 family members and friends of chronically online people, Grass is a surefire way to get back in touch with what truly matters. So what are you waiting for? Go outside today and touch some grass. It will help, trust me. Okay, now back to the devlog. The next stage of the gameplay loop which we're going to tackle is permanent upgrades. The permanent upgrade system is going to take the shape of a menu that will allow the player to buy and upgrade equipment for the player and drone. At its most fundamental, it needs to be comprised of these features. Display options of equipment available for player and drone, display resources the player has collected, allow the player to spend resources to buy or upgrade equipment, allow the player to equip equipment to take into the next game session. To start off, I use this information to create a mock of what the menu should look like, and here it is. This section will display the player and drone equipment available. Here will show the resources collected by the player. This box will display the resources needed to craft or upgrade selected equipment. And finally, this button will allow for the selected equipment to be crafted or upgraded. Taking a look back at the equipment slots for player and drone, you can see that functionality for selecting between each slot for both player and drone has been added when clicking. Also, when clicking on an already selected slot, an e-symbol will appear showing that the equipment in that slot has been equipped. Next, I spent some time designing some mediocre icons for each level of equipment in the game. Well, at least the health symbols are somewhat passable. After adding them to the game, you can see the level 1 icons in the equipment menu. Next, I added functionality to craft and upgrade selected equipment using the button in the bottom right hand corner. Here you can see the icon and name for each slot updated when the next level is unlocked. Also, the button is disabled when the item reaches max level, indicating there is no more upgrades for that particular piece of equipment. After this, I made it so when clicking on an equipment slot, it would show the resources required to upgrade in the box on the right hand side of the menu. Then, I added a check that would only allow a craft or upgrade if there were enough resources, which is shown in the top right hand corner. Otherwise, the button would be disabled. And with that, we can say that the permanent upgrade stage of the gameplay loop is done. And now it's time to move on to the final stage, spawn. To start out, I added a button at the bottom of the equipment menu that when pressed would take you to a new instance of the game. On top of this, I added functionality to the back to menu button on the dev screen, returning you to the equipment menu when pressed. Next, I made it so that all resources that you collect in the actual game scene are taken back with you to the equipment menu when you die, adding to the current resources that you've already collected. Then I added a default metal sword that the player would use if no other weapon was manually equipped in the equipment menu. After this, I made it so that either player or drone equipment that was equipped in the menu would then be taken forward into the game. Then I made it so that equipped equipment would show up in the level up system in the actual game. A level up would only be present for a particular piece of equipment if it had been upgraded to a higher level than 1 and that it hadn't already been leveled up to its max level that it was upgraded to in the menu. And with that, all the systems in the equipment menu were now fully connected with the systems in the actual game scene when the player spawns in. Now I think it's time to work on how the world spawns in when playing the game. Currently everything is hand placed, but I want to move to a more procedural generation way. I decided to go with a chunk system where the world is broken up into chunks of say 10 by 10, and only the chunk that the player is currently in and chunks directly around the player would be rendered at any time. Here you can see the chunks that are generated when spawning into the world, and how new chunks are generated in front of the player when it walks in any direction. Next, I added the code that would delete the chunks that are not directly around the player when it has moved into a new chunk. After this, I tried to make it so resources would randomly spawn in each chunk, but it didn't quite work out. After figuring out how the Z and Y axis work, I managed to get the resources spawning in correctly. Then I added code that would spawn the blob enemies in when generating chunks. I also made it so that any blob that was in a chunk would be deleted when the chunk was being removed due to the player moving away. Finally, I added some new colours to the blob enemies for variants. These would be randomly selected when generating a chunk. And with that, we can now say that the last stage of the gameplay loop, spawn, is complete, and that now the full gameplay loop is implemented into the game. Now the big question, is the game fun? No, well not really, not yet. But I think with time, after developing on the basic gameplay loop implemented here, I think it could be quite fun to play. Now if you did enjoy this video, why not like and maybe subscribe to see where this goes next. And if you haven't already, check out the first part of this devlog series. Thanks, bye.